국제적 노력과 그 어떤 미래 그 과제에 대해서 말씀해 주실 분은 이제 싱가포르 대학에 계신 토니 마이어 교수님이십니다. 토니 마이어 교수님을 소개하도록 하겠습니다. Hi, Tony. Hi, Tony.
Hello.
Hi. Nice
Can
to
you hear
see
me?
Yeah. Oh, please proceed your presentation.
Thank you, Kibyon, for the introduction. First of all, apologies for not being with you. As I explained, we have a very heavy agenda here in Singapore, and so that has prevented me from being with you physically, but of course, with modern technology, I feel I'm in the room with you anyway, so I'm with you virtually. But again, many apologies for not being actually in the room with you. And of course, I've been asked to speak about the World Conferences and their significance, and that's what I shall do. So can you see my presentation? Okay. So this is the title, Significance and Challenges of the Conferences, with special reference to the Singapore and the Montreal statements. So I'll talk a little the introduction. I'll then go through the three conferences that have taken place to date, and then say a few words about the forthcoming one, which will be at the end of May, early June next year in Rio. But first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the work of all my colleagues, and especially Nick Stenek, who has been really the inspiration behind the conferences and was co-chair of the first and second. And of course, I was also co-chair with him. It was my privilege to be co-chair with him on those occasions. And also thanks to Sabina Kleinert and Melissa Anderson, who co-chaired the Montreal conference, and of course are doing the same for the forthcoming Rio meeting. First of all, by way of introduction though, I want to just talk briefly about the growth of world research and global interconnectivity. And you will see from the figures here that, of course, between 2002 and the latest figures that I could find of 2011, there's been a huge increase on the spend on research and development worldwide. And the number of researchers has also increased significantly. It's up on 50% or more on 2002. That's a lot of people engaged throughout the world in the research endeavor. And of course, I'm also draw on this Knowledge Networks and Nations, the Royal Society of London's report in 2011. And from that, they were talking about now only 1/4 of all publications are authored by one or more than one, but in a single institution. In other words, about 75% of all publications are collaborative, and more than 1/3 of all publications result from international collaborations, and that's up from 25% in 1996 to 2011 when this report was issued, and is increasing virtually day by day. So that is the measure of the global research endeavor. And of course, with that, we really do need to ensure that we have research integrity, we have faith in each other's policies and procedures, and that is where the World Conferences can contribute so much in ensuring that we are all really pointing in the same direction and doing things to the same standard. So if I now come to the history of the conferences themselves, the first conference was held in Lisbon in 2007. It was held under the Portuguese European Union presidency and was supported by the European Commission. It was initiated by ESF, European Science Foundation, and the US Office of Research Integrity, and Nick was working with them at that time. and in partnership with the International Council for Science, ICSU, and we also had some support from NATO in respect of people from the Maghrebian, Middle East areas, and also the countries of the former Soviet Union to enable them to attend. But what I put up here are the key sponsors of that meeting, and you see also there COPE and EMBO, and these organizations, you will see their logos appearing later, and of course we're very indebted to the fact that they have seen this as a very important activity with which they have remained engaged. So the output of that conference was published at the end of 2007. The meeting took place in September of that year as an ESF ORI policy briefing. And there were three general recommendations. These were not formally debated within the meeting, but it was a general consensus that basically we should continue to work with the OECD Global Science Forum. And just a little word there, because at the same time as we were planning this first conference, Canada and Japan had asked the Global Science Forum to also engage itself with research integrity, and they had produced one of a report which we used as one of the key documents for the first conference. So we would continue to work with them. Recommendation 2 was the ESF and ORI should take the lead in developing a global clearinghouse for research integrity. In other words, the aim was, can we put all policies and procedures and perhaps case studies all into one database, a wiki-style database, so that people would put their own information. This is actually quite a major task. It's not an easy thing to do, and we have to decide who indeed would host such an activity. And I think generally this has been put on the back burner for some time now. And then the recommendation that we did, of course, follow up very much was that together we should begin planning for a second World Conference. The first one was very much a case of people coming together for the very first time and sharing their experiences, their knowledge, and in a sense, many people were saying, well, it's great to talk to you, you have the same problems I have, I am not alone. That sort of exchange was very important. And then, of course, it was actually in 2010, the Second World Conference came to Singapore, partly because I and the head of the European Science Foundation, Bertil Andersson, we had both moved to Nanyang Technological University. And this was held in 2010. We had more than 350 participants from over 50 countries, so it was really starting to become a world conference in numbers and in spirit. And of course, we developed from this the Singapore Statement. Now, again, just to show the sponsors, but you see COPE and others involved in the sponsorship of this conference, and that was very important. AAAS, and they have stayed with us as well into the future. EMBO, as I said. And so it's showing that these conferences are important to a wide range of organizations from across the world. And of course, we had support from, very generous support from within the research ecosystem in Singapore itself. So why did we have the Singapore Statement? Well, the feeling was we needed to achieve a trace, leave something, not just saying we've come together, we've had a very nice time, we've exchanged, we've networked, but something which had a longer-lasting legacy. It was not a legal document agreed by governments or agencies, because of course once you do that, you bring in lots of lawyers and they argue about the wording here or a full stop there, and it will take a very long time, as we witness, say, with all the climate agreements or non-agreements. So it was very much seen as a consensus document from the conference participants on basic principles and responsibilities. That it could also be a simple statement which could be posted on the walls of every lab and research room and could easily be translated, quoted from, and be adopted as the basis for other procedures, national, institutional, and so on. In other words, to be a foundational document. And of course, we didn't regard it as necessarily a formal code of conduct. Codes indeed provide a framework, but they don't of themselves guarantee we're all going to abide by them. And of course, they reflect national or institutional environments which differ, and therefore they themselves differ a lot. And they have to respond, as I say, to the local environment. In my view, they need to be in a simple and concise language, and there are many, of course, existing codes, and we can all draw on these as we need. And of course, looking at that, there's this wide variation in research integrity structures. And I just list the range here from the national systems applicable in the states, which have indeed a legislative and agency action base, through a quasi-judicial system in Scandinavia, to very much self-regulation by agencies and so on, for instance, the UK Concordat, or where that national approach does not exist, you go down to the institutional level, which is, of course, the case in, say, Hong Kong or here in Singapore. So turning to the Singapore statement itself, we had a general preamble. We outlined the 4 basic principles: honesty, accountability, professional courtesy and fairness, and of course good stewardship. And then we went into the detail of 14 responsibilities. So the important thing, and the very first one, integrity. Researchers have to take responsibility themselves. It cannot be shared. It has to rest with the individual. And up here I put some famous cases, and one of which, of course, you've been debating and talking about earlier today. The second means you've got to adhere to regulations. You have to be aware of what they are, and you have to adhere to those, and there are very many. And I'm grateful here to Nick, because he has added this frequency of violations, and his estimate is 1 to 10% of researchers actually either are not aware or certainly don't adhere to all of the structures and the frameworks surrounding them. Number 3, researchers should employ appropriate research methods for their work, base their conclusions on a critical analysis and so on. And of course, I'm not going to go through these in detail, but you can see the Nick's estimate of behaviors that happen and the impact on the research record. Research records themselves, everybody has to keep clear, accurate records. It allows verification. It's part of the scientific and research process that others need to be able to look and at data, replicate the work, replicate experiments, and so on. And of course, there are a larger number of people who certainly don't follow best practice. Next one was that of sharing data and findings, and with open access now, this is becoming much more the norm, But again, people are very reluctant to share for a whole variety of reasons. They either don't trust their colleagues, or they are anxious about IP, intellectual property issues, and so on. Authorship. And I know from my experience here that this is often at the core, at the heart of complaints and accusations and counter-accusations. And of course, we say in the statement that researchers should take responsibility for their contributions. And of course, in the more detailed guidelines, you acknowledge the contributions of others. But frequently there's this tendency that somebody who, say, has contributed one analysis to a study insists on or is given co-authorship. No, they should only have an acknowledgement. And of course, there are wide variations. There's also different publishing traditions in different disciplines, but we estimate that violations could be very high in this. And I know from my own experience, as I say, that this that authorship is at the heart of many disputes. Publication acknowledgement. This is in relation to ensuring that you acknowledge people, but also you cite properly the works of others. And this is where, of course, plagiarism and self-plagiarism come into the statement. Peer review, that people should provide fair and prompt, and prompt is very important, as well as rigorous evaluations. In other words, the whole system is based on peer review, but it does demand honesty in the way in which we all approach such requests for assessments. Next one was conflict of interest. Again, very important. Many journals now are increasingly asking for declarations of conflicts of interest, and this is very important, particularly when you're talking about links to, say, pharmaceutical companies or whoever is funding you. But generally, we should all be transparent about our links, our financial and other conflicts. And of course, it's better to in a sense, overdo it and than under-declare what conflicts of interest you think you may have. Public communications, and this was quite interesting debate in Singapore, I recall, and it of course is the issue of when you slip from being an objective expert and commentator to a campaigner, a lobbyist. And this is often very difficult in areas, as we've listed here, for human rights or environmental issues and climate change. And it is a very narrow line between giving your expert opinion on the area in which you have expertise and advocating particular policies and acting in a more political way. 11, it was the duty to whistleblow, and we all have that. It's not an easy thing to do, but generally, as Nick is saying here, research misconduct is underreported, and I find that myself. People are very reluctant to blow the whistle on colleagues, and particularly colleagues who are friends. But nevertheless, unless we all take responsibility, then things can go wrong, because after all, research is an area where self-regulation of research is the norm. We police ourselves. Then, of course, we need to be able to respond to such accusations and have appropriate and fair procedures in place. And that goes really without saying, but statements that often we say, go without saying, you have to actually say it, and that is why these responsibilities are listed in the statement. Of course, there are lots of pressures on researchers everywhere, and we need at the same time to be able to mentor the new researchers, to create the right environments which encourage integrity, and particularly through training and education. Of course, there's now a growing interest in such training, and these are starting to become mandatory in many places, for instance in the USA. The last one was actually very, shall we say, intensely debated, because there was an argument that societal considerations had no place in a statement on research integrity. Overall, I think, and this is why it's there, the majority was saying, yes, it should. At the very least, that we have to be aware that we have to, as individuals and groups of researchers, to understand what societal benefits may be and what risks are in the work that we are doing. And I think in the end, I was more than happy that this particular responsibility stayed within the Singapore statement. Of course, we were then able to go ahead with lots of translations, and we hope that people have been able to use it within their own language. Again, that's important, that not everybody is going to understand the subtleties of something in English if their mother tongue, let's say, is Croatian, and the subtleties are best conveyed to them in their own language. Then 3 years later, so that was the Singapore statement, and I think it's been much appreciated in many parts of the world. And indeed, it has been regarded very much as a foundational document. Then, of course, in 2013, we assembled again in Montreal, in Canada, this time under the co-chairing of Melissa and Sabina. And of course, again, there was a feeling we need to leave a real trace and address real issues from our conference. Now, I referred earlier to the increasing trend to research collaboration on an international or global scale. And of course, the Montreal statement addressed the issue, but of all cross-boundary research collaborations. And I'm not going to read through it, but you can all on the website read that preamble. But of course, we are talking about cross-boundary between institutions, between countries, between continents, between sectors, industry and academia, for instance, and of course between disciplines. And disciplines may also have their own disciplinary traditions, and all of those have to be taken into account if you are looking at integrity within that general collaborative environment. So again, it talks about integrity, trust, to be able to define the purpose and agree on the goals, because here we are talking about people coming from all sorts of different areas and agreeing to collaborate together. Our responsibilities in managing that collaboration. Whose regulations are you going to be following? Mine, yours, the third parties, or whatever. So there are a number of detailed things that we have to consider when we are managing these sorts of collaborative research projects. And as I say, there's increasing tendency in the world for these to be the norm. So again, if you look at these agreements, they have to be really understood by everybody. It's no good just signing something and say, well, I didn't really read it. You have to really understand the conditions on which you are working together. And of course, towards the end, you have to look at how you use your resources, how transparent you are, and how you monitor the progress and ensure that you are all working to the same sorts of schedules. Because of course, the worst thing is if one of the partners for one reason or another, really isn't completing work and therefore holding up or even destroying the work of the others within a partnership. And of course, this continues through dealing with issues such as the customary practices of different partners, conflicts, how you resolve these. And then you go on to the outcomes. Who owns the data? Who's going to store the data? These are things you have to sort out at the beginning of a partnership, but nevertheless, they are very important in terms of how the integrity of collaborative research. Of course, publications, we come back to the Singapore statement, what I said about authorship, publications being a very sensitive issue. It's even more sensitive when, say, you're working from one part of Canada to New Zealand and maybe in our part of the world. So, you know, it's more difficult then to come to such agreements together. And of course, number 19 is very important because, again, it is how you respond to allegations of misconduct or other irresponsible behavior. And here, within the collaboration, we have a duty to whistleblow and to help and assist anybody who is investigating such sorts of allegations. So now, in a sense, we are building up a family of research integrity statements. Singapore statement, the Montreal statement. The Singapore statement in particular was a foundational document on which the global research councils, where almost all the funding agencies in the world are coming together now, they had a statement of principles. It was important, in fact, that funding agencies actually took that responsibility to commit themselves to research integrity. And of course, through them, this becomes conditions of grant awards and so on. When we were developing the Singapore statement, within Europe, ALEA, the All-European Alliance, the collective of research of scientific and scholarly academies in Europe, and ESF came up with their own code. That itself became more of a foundational document for the Inter-Academy Council, the IAP policy report. So there are five, they link together, one fed into the other and so on, but those five now provide this family of research integrity statements. And of course, the two key ones derive from the World Conferences themselves. So now, looking ahead, we're en route to the fourth World Conference, and I'm sure many of you will be getting emails about registration and early bird registration and so on. And again, you see it, not only the beautiful picture of the beautiful coastline of Rio and Sugarloaf Mountain, but you will see, again, very familiar logos of people or organizations that have supported and continue to support the World Conference idea and how it is moving forward. I think interesting here now we see the sponsorship coming in and support coming in from such organizations as Turnitin. In other words, people who are engaged in producing the software by which we are actually investigating breaches of research integrity are also becoming part of this as well. So the steering committee of the Fourth World Conference have now come up with 4 focus tracks. The final track, of course, being to have a course on research integrity, which will precede the conference and hopefully will be attracting research students who can undertake that course. But the other 3 tracks are what institutions can do, what funders can do, and finally what nations can do. And of course, earlier on in the Singapore statement, we talked about institutions. We've seen through the Global Research Council funders taking on responsibilities, and of course nationally. But there's now tremendous pressure on all researchers throughout the world to deliver against strict targets, possibly not getting the amounts of money that you originally hoped you would get, but you still have to deliver. The whole promotion and tenure system in academia and the progression of careers depends on your output of your research. In other words, there's very strong pressure to deliver, and therefore there may be these tendencies. People feel, well, I have to take a shortcut in order to meet those targets. And then you're on a slippery slope into research misconduct. So addressing institutions, funders and nations, I think, is absolutely the right way to do it. We've talked about all the other issues, collaborative research, the individual responsibilities and so on in the earlier conferences. So this, I hope, will also not only be a great place to meet, a great place to talk about common problems, but will equally leave a legacy on which we can all draw. So that's the end of my presentation. I should say thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for allowing me to talk to you from Singapore. So again, thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
Diolch, and I think if I can pronounce it correctly, 감사합니다. Thank you.
예, 첫 번째 발표가 있었습니다. 원래 이전까지의 세션에서는 발표를 다 듣고 질문했었는데 이제 이렇게 웹으로 진행하다 보니까 혹시 토니 마이어 교수님 발표에 대해서 질문이 있으시면 먼저 그걸 하도록 하겠습니다. 혹시 질문 있으신가요? 예. Hi, Tony. Tony? 예. Could you hear me?
Hello?
리우 월드 컨퍼런스 이후에 일정이 어떻게 되시는지? So interval of World Conference.
Sorry, what are our schedules? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Schedule?
Yeah. When does it take
well,
place?
We would, in terms of the World Conferences themselves, I would hope that these will be continuing on a regular basis of about 2 to 3 year intervals, because it really does take about that long to be able to conduct the planning, determine your themes and your tracks, get the contributions in. I should say that in the first, second and third, the program was very much, I think, derived as top-down. What we are trying to do now with Rio is encourage in more a bottom-up, people within those focus tracks being able to make proposals as to what they want to talk about. So it's going to be a combination of bottom-up and top-down. The schedule would be then, as I say, about 2 to 3 year intervals. Whether each one will come up with a particular statement, I don't know. I think it really depends on the issues that actually get debated within that conference. But I can certainly see when you address institutions, funders and so on, there may be some statement that needs to come out of Rio. I'm not saying they should. Let's see what people say. But then we need to take all of those statements forward, and we need to all be aware and, as I say, have a family of documents on which we can all draw. And I think that's a very important legacy.
예, 아마 리오 컨퍼런스에 많은 참석을 부탁드린다는 것이 아마 결론인 것 같습니다. 예, 토니 씨 다시 감사드리고요. 그럼 두 번째 발표, 퀘스천?
Yes. Hello, Tony. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You spoke about the Singapore statement and said that social responsibility was an element that you supported. Could you expand on that? I'm curious to what your reasons were for wanting that element to be added into the statement.
Okay, well, thank you. We are of course, almost engaging in the sort of discussion that took place in Singapore. It was, is social responsibility part of research integrity? And I think that one cannot get away from the context in which one is working, and particularly when you get into issues of sensitive issues, particularly, say, which get near to dual use, you have to be aware of what the impact of your research may be. And just thinking of the work that was done in the Netherlands on the I think it was H5N1 flu virus, and of course that caused a lot of concern in security organizations around the world. If you go into, if you conduct such research, you surely need to be aware of the societal context. You need to be aware of what the benefits may be. I think we all would aim to create benefit by our research, but precisely how it's going to be used, we need to be aware of all those things. And I think that's what people, and I know in your meeting there are people who were in Singapore as well and engaged in that debate. We need really that broader awareness of what we are doing. And I think that's what I would say. I think it depends on the structure in which you're working, and very much on the individual, to what extent that is going to be influential. But I think in terms of the Singapore statement saying, at least be aware, and I think that's the important message.
다른 질문은 없으시면 예, 토니 씨에게 감사드리고 두 번째 발표를 진행하도록 하겠습니다. Tony, thank you again.
Kibyon, thank you very much for inviting me. As again, I'm sorry I'm not with you. I hope that we will be able to maybe have a beer together at some other occasion. Thank you very much.
예.